Hello everyone, if you've joined us early there, this is our Wave Trust live event where we're going to be talking about the early years, how the brain develops during this time and why this is so important, not just for infants and parents, but for all of us. Now our event is set to start at 6 p.m, so we're just going to give it a couple more minutes for everyone else to see if they're able to join us. Throughout this, please do put any comments into the stream and I'll be happy to interact with you and answer any questions you have or just pick up on any topics you suggest as we go along. So 2 minutes and we'll be getting going. May I also say that if you haven't already liked the 7030 campaign page, please do. We are regularly posting information on here about the early years, about trauma, and about all the areas that our campaign focuses on. Oops, sorry there. I had my own voice in the background, and it was working on a bit of a loop there. So I was hearing myself go. So just about 1 more minute, and then we're going to get started. And if you are watching this later as well, please do feel free to add your comments into the stream. I'm always happy to respond to them a little bit later, and it's always good to get a conversation going, even if it's a day or two after the live event was broadcasted. There we go. So it's 6 o'clock. Let's get going. So just to introduce myself, my name is Aidan Phillips. I work for the charity Wave Trust, the charity who are behind the 7030 campaign. So Wave Trust was established 25 years ago, and our purpose was to look to the very roots of abuse, neglect, and other adversities that can cause trauma to children, and to see how we might prevent them from happening in the first place. We spent 25 years researching solutions to this and seeking to implement them with governments, with local authorities, and with individuals on the ground. Now, roughly about 12 years ago, we set up what we call the 7030 campaign, the goal to reduce child maltreatment by 70% by the year 2030. Now, this aim was settled on after we spoke to a variety of senior practitioners in social care, in policing and education, and various fields. And we asked them what they thought was possible if the right programs and the right policies were put in place. And the figure 70% was what they came to. Now, this campaign is overseen by us, but it isn't really driven by us. It's driven by ambassadors, people on the ground in their communities across the UK and Ireland who are spreading awareness of what trauma is, how it can affect children during the early years, and how we can actually prevent this from happening. There are people who are seeking to create trauma-informed communities, spread awareness so that we have trauma-informed services, and generally looking to push this movement that is spreading across the country and that is creating a lot of good results already. Now, the purpose of today's event is just to talk through the area which is closest to our hearts and the area where we feel we can have the greatest single impact. And that's early years prevention. By early years prevention, we mean understanding how the brain develops during that crucial period from conception to age 2, when our brain is developing at its most rapid pace. To know how certain negative experiences can affect it adversely, and what positive experiences can help build those strong foundations for mental health later in life. And then looking at what programs and policies we need in place to take advantage of that science and give every child the best start in life. Now, today's session isn't going to be talking about the policies and programs as such, but talking about the science behind it. What actually happens during those stages of brain development, and why are they so important, not just for infants, but for everyone later in life. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to share a screen so you can see this throughout the rest of the hour. I'd also like to say before we begin that Wave Trust are going to be hosting a series of early years masterclasses during July, August and September, with our first one taking place next week on the 15th of July. These won't be hosted by myself, but instead by our CEO, George Hosking, the man who founded the charity and the person who's been advising governments and local authorities on this area for a long time. If you'd like to find out a little bit more about those masterclasses, you're welcome to see them. They're in the pinned post on the 70/30 campaign Facebook page, and they will be a fantastic opportunity to really get an in-depth understanding of this crucial area and how it's relevant to your work. They are also CPD accredited events if you are a practitioner. So, sharing our screen now. As soon as it lets me do it. There we go. I'm just going to put down full screen so you're able to see that. Excellent stuff there. Oh, apologies. I'll try that again. There we go. So, let's start off right at the very beginning. Start off with the very basics of how our brains develop during these early years. Now, one question for you all, for anyone who's listening. That little child on the screen there, he has what are known as synapses in his head, connections between the different cells through which information is transferred. Now, who do you think has the most number of connections in their head? This little fella on the screen, or you? If we do have anyone listening at the moment, please do put your comments in the stream there. Otherwise, just ask yourself this question for a minute. Who has the most connections between the cells in their head? Okay, if you answered this little fella on the screen here, then you were correct. This guy here, in fact, has many, many more connections in his head than you have or will ever have again in your life. It's a very strange phenomenon that the baby's brain is in many ways more active than many of ours, especially seeing as they don't always look like they're as switched on as you'd expect. A lot of this comes down to the way in which we evolved. So you have to bear in mind that the mind itself is our greatest survival asset. We need to have that in order to cope with the challenges that nature throws at us. However, it poses certain problems. For one thing, in order to actually push out a child with a fully grown brain, a woman in her current state, it would effectively kill her. It would be a very dangerous procedure. However, if women were to have far larger hips, in order to manage this, then they wouldn't be able to run as easily from predators. So, nature came up with a compromise. It made women's hips slightly wider, but more than that, it made sure human babies were born very prematurely, so that they were small enough to be able to push out more safely. Now, the ramifications of this for the way in which we developed were massive. It meant that most of our development, most of the basic underlying development of how our brain grows, both physically but also mentally and emotionally, doesn't occur in some little cataclysm of the womb, where it definitely can be influenced by the experiences the mother has, but it occurs within the context of a social environment where we're actually interacting directly with other people all the time. Now, during this period, the baby will be constantly trying to learn new things, and the connections that are developing in their head are happening at a rate of about 1.7 million per second. It's a very educational experience these early years for them. And they learn and learn and learn more things and build up all these connections. And then once they get around 2 to 3 years old, as their brain reaches the stage that it probably would have reached originally when they'd been born, then the connections start to whittle away. The ones that aren't used that often start to go off, and the ones that are used repeatedly continue to harden. That is why babies have so many more connections in their heads than we do. Now, when we talk about the various sorts of things that are developing during this period, I'll just give you a few examples here. For instance, by about 3 months old, we have the peak creation of our synapse connections when it comes to what we can visualize. If you leave a child in the dark throughout the first year of their life, there's a chance they may not actually be able to develop the ability to see. Similar thing happens with our ability to not only hear but understand other people's sounds, other people's voices, and the various different messages they're giving. If you get a child when they're about 5-6 months old or so, then they can tend to pick up on, say, for instance, a Japanese person might pronounce L and R, and the way an English person might pronounce L and R. They can pick up on both of them. But by the time you get to 12 months, they start to distinguish between the two and find whichever one they're more familiar with a lot easier. That's why it's often very beneficial to be able to introduce children to language at a young age. They're able to pick it up a lot easier. The crucial thing about this, and hello there, Elizabeth, I see you said hi in the stream there. The most crucial part of this development is where it comes to the emotional brain. By about 18 months in, the emotional brain is largely created. And I emphasize the word largely. It continues to develop after that and can certainly be influenced for years afterwards. But a lot of the core foundations are laid by this point. And that's very crucial for what we're going to be talking about today, because it's really the emotional brain is where a lot of the traumatic experiences can have their greatest effect, and where the scars from it are often left years in the making. It's also where the very foundations of empathy are first developed, and where our ability to bond and attach with other people, or not attach under some circumstances, occur. Now, when you have positive experiences during this time, when you have a stable, loving household, when you are in regular interaction with other humans, when you get a sense of safety and security, then you are going to have a strong foundation in terms of your emotional brain going forwards. Doesn't mean you can't accrue damage or have to adapt to difficult situations later, but it does mean that you've got off to a good start. If you don't have this positive start, then if you experience damaging circumstances during these first 18 months or so, or when you're in the womb, then the damage that occurs can be more deep-rooted, can be more difficult to unearth, be more difficult to help resolve or help a person recover from than had it occurred at any other part in life. And this is why it's so key to actually focus on development during this period. For both positive and negative reasons, it can have a very large impact. And just to give you a bit of a visual representation here, because I'm talking about emotional brains and rational brains. If you see here on this quite simplified version of the image of the brain here, you can see the outer layer, the kind of, how would I describe it? Cushiony like white outer layer that we see on the top of the brain there. That was the part that developed later. And much of that, especially at the front of the brain, deals with our rational thinking, which effectively helps us to slow down our emotional urges and take a moment to think twice about them. That part you see just below that, the kind of squiggly question mark shape part as it's shown on the screen, is our limbic system. And that's where a lot of our emotions come from. So when we're talking about the rational and emotional brain, these are the parts that we mean. So I'm going to give you a little story just to give an insight into why this isn't just important for infants and parents at this age, but why this can have an impact on how the rest of their life pans out. And this comes from a study in the beautiful town of Dunedin in New Zealand. Now, in the 70s, they got a grant at the university so they could assess all the children who were born 3 years earlier in the town. And they had a cohort of just over 1,000 of them, and they put these kids through their paces. They tested their motor skills, tested their social skills, they tested their aggressiveness, their levels of anxiety. They tested all different facets of their emotional, physical, and mental development. Hello there, Susie Steele. Nice to see you in the comments there. And they noticed, when they were looking at this group, that there was about 20% or so who they considered to be high risk. These were kids who were a bit more aggressive, a bit more withdrawn, who didn't seem to be developing at the same social levels as the others. And they noticed there was overlap here between low levels of IQ, between evidence of child maltreatment at home, and other things such as poor socioeconomic circumstances. Now, I don't know who they were friends with at the university or whoever else was given the grants, but they kept securing grants years and years later. Every few years, they would bring the same cohort back, and they'd go through another research stage where they'd ask them what was happening in their life, find out their medical records, find out about their lifestyle. And they managed to track these people, a large chunk of them at least, into their 40s. And what they realized later on was that, again, they were noticing that roughly 20% of the cohort was actually responsible for a large chunk of what could be called high cost to society. Things like the number of criminal convictions, the number of times they had to receive prescriptions or welfare benefits. There are also higher levels of, for instance, domestic violence, unwanted teenage pregnancies, high school dropouts, and all other negative trajectories or undesirable trajectories in some case. Obviously depends on the circumstance in some of them. They also realized that this group of about 20% tended to overlap with that high cost 20% who they identified at just 3 years old. And they came to the stunning conclusion that by analyzing the child's behavior at 3, you could, with a stunning level of predictability, work out the general trajectory of their life from there on. Now, the moral from this isn't that beyond 3 years old, it's hopeless and you may as well give up if it's going badly. Obviously, there are great changes you can make. You can make changes in your life well into middle age and old age. But it does show the profound impact that those early years experiences can have, especially when parents and others involved in the child's life aren't aware of changes and where no interventions have been made to move on from them. Hi there, Natalia. Yes, the Wave page. At the moment, the Wave page was set up many years ago, and I'm just in contact with Facebook at the moment to regain access to it as well. So unfortunately, we weren't able to share it on the Wave page on this occasion, but we will be able to during future events. So if anyone has any questions just about the brain development and the other things that we're discussing, do feel free to add them into the comments here. Happy to have a bit of a back and forth and discussion with it. Or if there are just any points you want to make or topics you want to see discussed, please do add them in there as well. So I want to talk about one of these really key points, one of these key factors in development during this period. And this is called attunement. Now, attunement really relates to how we initially begin to bond with other people, which very often is with one parent or both of our parents, as very often are the most important people in our lives at that stage. Now, this is a man, Dr. Alan Shaw, a man who had an eidetic memory where anything he read, he could memorize. And after immersing himself in tons and tons of papers over the years, he was asked, how would you sum up in a sentence what you found out from all this? And the most important message he came away with was this: the child's first relationship, the one with the mother, it acts as a template for their capacity to enter into all later emotional relationships. Now, you could possibly exchange mother for caregiver, as I imagine in some situations it may be a different person, but very often it would be. And this does kind of lay down how not only are those interactions we have in the early years important for infants then, but actually have a very long-term impact, like they did with the Dunedin study. And attunement plays a very key part in that. To be attuned with one another very much means to be in tune with one another. It doesn't mean you have to copy or mimic the other person. It can just mean that you are in sync. Say, for instance, the parent smiles at the baby laughs back, the parent claps their hands, the baby waves their hands in the air, the parent smiles again, and the baby claps. They're not necessarily doing the same things at the same time, but there is certainly a connection between them. And this is really important for the baby. It seems like incredibly basic stuff, but it's teaching the baby that when it does something, it has an impact on the other person doing something. And they start to see their actions through the other person's eyes, which, as obvious as it sounds to us, is pretty much revolutionary at that stage in their life. And one of the reasons why this is so key is that to be able to see something through another person's eyes is effectively at the very root of empathy itself. And empathy itself is at the root of how we develop morality. So all those peekaboo games and those silly little games which you play with babies, they may look like they're not doing much, but actually they're playing a very important role in the maintenance of human civilization as well as their own development. Now, in most cases, empathy will develop accordingly. It will develop well, and the child will go on to be a morally decent person, someone who really feels other people's pain, someone who instinctively wants to care for others, someone who's capable of loving others. That is very much what happens in the vast majority of cases. Now, it's not so much a case of you are empathetic or you are not empathetic. Ultimately, it is a scale, all the way from very high empath people to people who are either psychopathic or sociopathic through genetics or through their own experiences. One of the things we can do is we can look at certain things that can act as an indicator for development of empathy. For instance, what the responsiveness is from their mother during the first 10 to 12 months. As we saw there, lack of responsiveness can harm attunement, and the lack of attunement can harm the development of empathy. This is a study by Shaw in 2001. And when they looked at infants who had low levels of responsiveness, they noticed that even right at the very young age, they were starting to notice difference in symptoms, just like they did in Dunedin. And those symptoms started escalating over time. And by the time we get to 6 years old, still very young, still young and innocent in many ways, the child was exhibiting quite aggressive extroverted behavior. Now, this is really focused on an extroverted example. You can also find results where the child may become very withdrawn, or they may become very anxious as well. There are various different impacts, but ultimately it does show just how crucial that process of attunement is. And also, one thing that's worth emphasizing here, low maternal responsiveness is not necessarily abuse or neglect. It could even be as a result of postnatal depression. It could be as a result of external circumstances or just lack of awareness of what the baby requires. So it's worth saying that it's not always necessarily the most malicious sounding incidents that can have an impact. Anything that is perceived by the baby as putting it in a vulnerable position can achieve that. Now, another key process that is worth looking at is attachment. Now, attachment is something that follows on from attunement, and it's how we take that to the next level from knowing that our actions can have an impact on others and seeing things through their eyes to actually how we form social bonds with other people, or as it says on the screen, don't form social bonds with other people. Now, if you ever come across attachment theory before, you'll have certainly heard the name John Bowlby. For those who haven't, John Bowlby was really the originator of this theory. Back in the 50s at the time, the general perspective on child development was that ultimately what you need is a roof over your head, meal in front of you, and someone who's going to protect you against saber-toothed tigers or whatever other dangers are out there. Slightly going back early in the 50s there, but you get the picture. John Bowlby and others at the time were arguing that actually what mattered more for our emotional development was the connections and bonds we had with other people. And this was initially ridiculed and not thought highly of, but over time he has been vindicated through nonetheless studies such as the Dunedin study. And nowadays we recognise that as much as it is important to cater to a child's physical needs and the bread and butter stuff, the actual nurture and attention and the sense of love and safety they get from their parents is actually crucial to their development too. Now, over years, different classifications for attachment styles have developed. We're going to keep it simple here and just focus on the 4 key ones. So there's 2 broad categories here. There's secure attachment and there's insecure attachment. Secure attachment is really what you most want to be aiming for, and it's what we tend to see in the majority of the population, although slightly smaller percentages in poorer areas. Secure attachment is when the child has a sense that the parents are there to look after them, come what may, and they are going to be protected and looked after. It's where they have clear boundaries for what they can and can't do. They feel safe enough to go out and explore, and they feel safe to go to someone for security too. And that ends up with a person years later into adulthood where they're reasonably comfortable on their own, reasonably comfortable with other people. They can connect with others, they can trust in others, and ultimately there's a sense of calm and stability in their relationships. Insecure attachment is where you don't, unfortunately, have those positive foundations laid. And it can manifest in a number of ways. So I'm just going to have a look at some of them now. Let's start off with ambivalent. To be ambivalent, as the example shows on the screen, is where you are desperate to be close to this person you're attached to. Could be a parent, could be a boyfriend, a girlfriend, wife, husband. You are desperate to be close to them, and you're very nervous about the idea of not being close to them. It is a sort of person who might be what you'd often call clingy in some ways. A person who might be quite anxious if you don't let them know what you're doing at all the times. A person who might feel very jealous if you seem to be just spending time with other people. This can sometimes develop if the amount of attention a child received was intermittent during those early years, where they really loved it when they got the attention they wanted, but then they really felt sad and a little bit scared when the attention wasn't there. And so they ended up growing or developing this obsession with wanting this attention as much as possible. Whenever it was there, they would desperately try and make the most of it. And wherever it was gone, they'd start to fear that maybe it wouldn't come back. And you can see over time how that develops from just the ordinary interactions you have with a baby into how you might relate to other relationships as an adult. Then we've got avoidant attachment. Avoidant attachment's the opposite in many ways, even if sometimes you can have similar experiences or very similar underlying driving factors. There's an example on the screen here that I give where there's someone who, it doesn't necessarily mean that they dislike being around other people or they don't want to have partners or relationships with relatives and friends, but it means that they tend not to get particularly close. They're not very good at expressing their emotions. When things get emotional, they want to get away from the situation, or as it says here, shout it down or shut it down. They're people who can go a bit numb quite easily when it comes to emotions as really a defense mechanism. And they're quite comfortable with being on their own and quite comfortable with that as part of their identity. These are sometimes situations where the attention that you got during an early years wasn't particularly positive, either all the time or parts of the time, where the concept of getting attention from caregivers or protective adults wasn't necessarily seen as a positive thing. And so over time you develop this idea that actually, when I'm not getting attention, that might be a good thing. I might be safer this way. And when people start to get very close to me, and expressing emotions quite intensely can lead to that impression, that could actually create a sense of danger and could create a potential threat. You can see here how these experiences in the early years, they're lessons. They're memories that are embedded in your head and the lessons they leave in your subconscious that we end up acting out on the basis of instinct later on, often without even realizing it, unless we actually come to terms with the way our psychology works or are helped to get there by a therapist or someone similar. And then we have disorganized attachment. Now, disorganized attachment is arguably the worst of the three. Because when it comes to ambivalent or avoidant attachment, yes, it's not necessarily ideal, but at least you have a system. You have some sort of structure within which, once you know yourself, then you can work with that and other people can tell what sort of person you are and they can work with that too. Disorganized attachment is when you don't really have a system. You're not comfortable being close to people or being away from people. Attention is dangerous. Lack of attention is also dangerous. You want to desperately cling on to this sense of attachment and connection to someone, while at the same time you want to push them away the second it seems threatening. And that happens often. It's chaotic. There's no real structure. There's nothing to base things on. And it can lead to repeated issues with relationships throughout life. Here's a rather sad example of disorganized attachment. I'm sure everyone will remember the baby P incident years ago. Now, there's a story from a social worker who actually went round to baby P's house at one point, and she remembers opening the door, and you could hear a dog barking outside. So the baby's crawling along the floor, and he freezes because he's scared of dogs. So he turns around and he starts walking, or crawling rather, to the other door. At which point it opens and his stepdad comes in and he freezes again. He's terrified of the dogs. He's terrified of his stepdad. And he doesn't know where to move, so he just freezes in the center. This is a sign of a child who's experienced a real environment of fear. And you often find that disorganized attachment overlaps quite strongly in many instances, not all, but in many of them, with evidence of abuse and neglect in the household. So you can see how those sorts of experiences with people who you're very close to, people who you see as there to protect you and there to support you, can go on to have these long-term negative effects in the way in which you relate to people subconsciously. And these are just a few of the other examples, because I talked a little bit about relationships, but ultimately those sorts of experiences can have multiple different types of ramifications, from tendency to be aggressive or anxious, from tendency to contract depression or anxiety, and various issues with social services and educational achievement, and so on and so forth. Again, one of the things I really do want to emphasize, and I'll say it again later, none of this is really guaranteed. It's like with the Dunedin study. It's not as if you get to 3 years old and you say, well, you're hopeless if things have turned out this bad, so don't hope to ever get better. No, it's not the case. Good experiences at any point in your life can help you turn on a different path. And certainly the younger you are, the better a chance you have of actually coping with any emotional issues you may have been left with, and helping yourself to actually get to a better place, both personally and the way in which you behave too. So by no means is any of this meant to be deterministic or guaranteed. It is merely about high levels of probability and the potential that such instances can cause. As with earlier on, if you do have any questions, please do add them into the chat there. I'd just like to reiterate for people who are joining a little bit later for us, Wave Trust is going to be hosting a series of events on the early years, talking through the importance of this period and the science behind it, the policies we need to actually give every child the best start in life, and what programs and approaches we can use to make that happen. If you go onto the 7030 campaign page, you'll be able to see the link to that in the pinned post. And these are going to be led by our CEO, George Hosking, a man who has been researching this area and implementing solutions for it for the past 25 years. So we've talked a little bit about how certain negative experiences can have an impact and the way in which that can happen. Now we're going to talk more directly about trauma, what we mean by it, and what it can actually look like, and how it can happen in certain instances, but not others. Firstly, let's just give what is an extreme but very telling example of just how impactful negative early years experiences and traumas can be. Out beyond the Iron Curtain, President Ceausescu in Romania, he was becoming increasingly obsessed with the birth rate in the country. He banned abortion. They were encouraging women to have tons of babies, giving them tax incentives, giving them medals. They even had a gynecological police force or something similar to that at some stage, which sounds very dystopian, but that was the situation they were in. So lots of babies were being born, but unfortunately, lots of parents couldn't afford to look after them. And so many ended up in what became very overcrowded, very underfunded orphanages. And you would have rows and rows of these babies who were crying day in, day out, and they were just lying there and they weren't being given attention because the staff, try as much as they could not give each child as much attention as they wanted. And this is a form of trauma for the child because they're experiencing what is by default a feeling of neglect for them. by not receiving this attention, not receiving this attunement, not having the opportunity to build that secure attachment with other human beings. And you can see here that this didn't just have an impact negatively on their mental health or their emotional health, but also on the physical development of their brain. Those pictures here are actually life-size. And you can see that it's not just the physical growth of the brain, but the activity in it. Because if you look at that one on the right-hand side, you'll see those giant black patches in the center, including around the hippocampus, where our memories are stored. So this is an extreme example, granted. However, it is a good example that when we're talking about trauma, we're not just talking about the mental and emotional impacts, as numerous as they can be. We're also talking about a very physiological process too. So, trauma is very closely related in many instances to the stress response system. And in order to explain trauma, I think it helps to have a better understanding of what happens to our body when we're in a stressful moment. So I'm going to take this example from Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who is the Surgeon General in California, and who is doing a hell of a lot of good work around trauma and its prevention in that part of the world. As Nadine tells it, imagine that you're walking through a forest. You're out on a hiking trip, and you stop at one point, you turn to your left, and you see this in the clearing, a giant grizzly bear. Now, what is happening to you at this moment? Do feel free to add your comments into the feed there. I don't know if any of you have had any experiences actually coming across a bear in reality. If you have, please do share. If not, then please do share what you think would be happening at the moment, how you might react, what might be going through your head and through your body. So some of the examples you could think of, you'll take a sharp intake of breath quickly, you'll freeze, you'll hear your heart pounding faster, you'll probably even feel a chill going up your arms and up your spine. These are all the things that we're going to be seeing on the surface. What I want to do is I want to look a little bit deeper to what's happening beneath the surface. Now, one of the first things that happens is a small part of your brain called the amygdala sounds the alarm. It goes, that's a bear. We know from past experience that bears are dangerous, so let's get ready for action. And it triggers off this series of processes throughout the body. One of them sends signals to your adrenal glands next to your kidneys, and it says make adrenaline. And that's what opens up your airways and gets your heart pumping faster. And that's really your hormones to get you ready for action in the moment. Other processes will activate some of the longer term stress hormones, like cortisol. Good question there, Natalia. I'll get to you just in one moment. I'm just going to finish this analogy and then I'll answer your question about emotional processing. Some of the longer term stress hormones, such as cortisol. And these are things that are there to help you prepare in case you're in this environment of danger for some time. Say, for instance, it may raise your blood pressure, alter your dietary instincts, and also disrupt your sleeping pattern, because you don't want to be a deep sleeper if you're surrounded by bears in a forest. Another key thing that happens is that inflammation, the parts of your body that build inflammation, start to get fired up. Because if that bear does swipe you, you want to be able to send information to the point as quickly as possible so that you can start to heal. And finally, one last thing that's key here is when it comes to your ability to think rationally. Now, this isn't really the time to be philosophizing about bears. You want to react off instinct. And to react off instinct, your brain will dial down the parts that deal with rational thinking so that the emotional brain can take charge. So this is a very good system. And ultimately, it's one that is going to help us survive in many different instances. However, the problem here is that it's supposed to be a temporary system. It only activates occasionally when it's needed. What happens if it's constantly being activated? What happens if you always feel like you're in this woods surrounded by bears, or if you go home at night and the bear is there every time? This is where we start moving on from a stressful incident that was bad, but was consigned to the past, to stress that we cannot properly process because we're constantly feeling vulnerable. This is where it has the potential to become long-lasting trauma. Now, Natalia, you said about emotional processing and emotional regulation and how and when these develop. We were going to cover this in a little bit, but I will just start picking up on these here now. So in order to actually regulate our emotions, we first have to be taught by someone else how to do it. So when a baby cries and you go up and you soothe them and you calm them down, you're effectively teaching them little tricks about how to actually calm themselves down. It's the same when it comes to a lot of this face-to-face playing. And when you're going through that process of attunement, you're also teaching them basically how to understand the world around them and how to actually remain calm. And this is also often why actually remaining calm around infants and babies is seen as such a positive thing. It also works for other age groups. It's just particularly useful as infants because you're effectively modeling for them how to react in many different circumstances. It's also worth saying that in terms of our emotional regulation, we feel like we are confident and comfortable in the world if we're in a world that is secure and a world that is stable and one we understand. So if a child feels like it has loving, caring parents that are there to look after it, that are there to protect it, then the child feels that it has the confidence to actually go out and try things, explore things, do new things, and actually meet other people as well. And through this, the child is learning this sense of confidence and self-esteem, which is going to later help it to be able to cope with more stressful instances as it grows to an older child and an adult. It's also worth saying that merely the fact that you know you are cared for and loved by other people, by your wider tribe, as we are social animals, has an enormous impact on your ability to actually just feel at calm and at peace with yourself. This applies to adults as much as anyone else. There was a fantastic lecture done by the former Chief Medical Officer of Scotland, Sir Harry Burns, where he asked the audience, what do you think is the greatest indicator of life expectancy? And people are saying things like, whether you smoke, whether you exercise, what you eat. And he's saying, well, yeah, these are all in the top 10. They're all important, but it's not the single greatest one. And the single greatest one was how strong your social connections with others were, how strong your friendships and relationships were, and how often you interacted in them. So that has an enormous impact on our bodies and our minds staying calm. And that begins from those early relationships we experience, that process of attunement with the primary caregivers and the attachment styles that we develop from there. So I hope that goes some way to answering your question, Talia, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk through resilience in a little bit after this section here. So just going back to this one here, I talked about how certain instances have the potential to go from being merely a stressful moment, which is not nice to experience, but you can consign it to the past, to something that feels like you are constantly in a state of vulnerability. And I'm going to give you a few examples here. And sorry if anyone obviously has experienced any of these things. I appreciate it can be unsettling sometimes to see it on the screen. And if you do want to take a moment out, please feel free to do so. You're also welcome to contact me on Aidan Phillips on Facebook if ever you wish, or via the Wave Trust website, just if you want to talk for anything afterwards. Now, you can see how things such as living in a violent household or a war zone, you can see how they could cause a sense of ongoing vulnerability. Most people can really understand that, and you don't need too much psychological insight to work it out. There are other examples like parental separation that aren't quite as clear-cut, because in the vast majority of cases, this tends not to pose a genuine risk to the physical integrity of the child. And yet it can still cause trauma on a similar level to the others. Now, why does this happen? Well, for instance, I will start that sentence again. Why does this happen? It really comes down to perception. Ultimately, what causes trauma isn't how overwhelming or threatening an instance is, but how overwhelming and threatening it is perceived to be by the person experiencing it within the context they're in. So let's say you're 21 years old and your parents separate. You're probably not going to be happy about it. You might be quite sad, really, but you're not going to be left feeling vulnerable. You're an adult. You're very much able to look after yourself. This is not going to affect your ability to actually survive in the world. This is very unlikely to actually cause trauma. But what if you're a young infant whose brain is still developing? You don't really understand the world around you. All you really understand is that you're very vulnerable and your survival is dependent on these two people. And if things feel unstable, if things feel like they're cracking, and especially if it's acrimonious and angry and there's shouting and there's arguing, this can feel like a genuine threat to your existence with all the information you know. And this is why a young child, especially an infant, experiencing a parental separation, even if they don't see the vast majority of the actual processes happening, can actually experience enough overwhelming, consistent stress for it to have a long-lasting traumatic impact. So it's the perception that matters more than the actual threat itself. Now, trauma can be caused by a single event. A single event can be overwhelming or threatening enough, or a series of these events, or a wider environment. And you tend to find that it is a wider environment quite often because single adversities tend to be mixed with others. If there's an instance of domestic violence in the household, it's not really unheard of for the perpetrator to be an alcoholic, the victim to have mental health issues, or the violence to be witnessed or even spill over towards the children. In terms of how it actually affects someone, yes, there's the impact on the stress response system, both in the moment and potentially for years to come. And that can heighten the likelihood of reacting aggressively or anxiously, of switching off and going into the freeze mode, or of having a wide range of symptoms, because ultimately we can react in a wide range of ways to threats in the moment when we're stressed, and we can carry on those effects later on with trauma. But it's not just the stress response system. There's also an emotional component beyond this as well. Let's say, for instance, taking that example a moment ago, that the violence has spilled over from between the parents towards the children. Maybe the infant has experienced this, or maybe they've witnessed an older sibling experience this. Now, obviously, there's the physical threat at play here, but it's more than that. This person who's being violent towards you is the person who you trusted to protect you. Are they the protector? Are they there to support you, or are they the threat? There's a lot of confusion going on here. They will act like and say they love you, and then they'll act like this, and it feels very confusing. Is it your fault, or is it theirs? Is this the way the world is, or is this an aberration? Is this the way it's going to be for a long time, or is this temporary? Lots of levels of confusion that can happen to children at any age, but the younger you get, the more confusing it can be, and the greater the impact can be too. Because it's not just your stress response system that's being affected, it's your ability to trust others, connect with others, and to know who you can actually trust and connect in both instances. Now, when we look at the way in which it can impact, you can see how the way in which you perceive yourself and the world, and the way in which it affects your stress response system, can affect just a wide range of behaviors. And it can have that effect not just within the short term, it really can go on indefinitely if you never are able to attend to it, or are never really made aware of it, and if you're never able fully to resolve it. That's not to say, by the way, that it's impossible to overcome. By all means, a lot of people go through therapy and fully resolve it, or they are able to come to terms with it in a way that they make it much more manageable, and that they're able to go on and live a good life, both personally and in their interactions with others. But often it can still be left with some scars from these trauma memories. And especially if it happens during the early years, they can be very deeply embedded as well. Now, we often have this phrase, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Now, naturally, as we know from looking at these experiences, this isn't necessarily true. However, it's a bit more of a complex picture, because ultimately there are some stressful experiences that can actually go on to leave you more resilient, and there are other stressful experiences that can go on to cause more long-lasting damage. Now, Harvard Center the Harvard University Center for the Developing Child came up with a way of designating these types, I should say. And they came up with the categories of positive, tolerable, and toxic stress. Now, positive stress is the beneficial little bits of stress that we get on an everyday basis. We have to go give a speech at work. We're a 17-year-old who has to drive for the first time. Kids start in school for a new day, and all the little things that happen throughout the day. Maybe we have to meet a deadline for work or for school homework. And these little bits of stress, they push us. They give us a little bit of a boost. And it's a bit nerve-wracking during the moment, but when we get past it, the stress levels drop. And the next time we do it, we're better able to cope with it. This is a very beneficial thing at any age. Even with young babies, there are certain moments where, as much as they do require a lot of attention from the parents, the very occasional time where they just have to spend a little bit of time growing accustomed to the parent not there can be beneficial as part of the wider mix. Ultimately, we need that little bit of stress in our lives in order to grow as people. Now, tolerable and toxic stress are where things happen that really have the potential to rattle you, that really have the potential to leave a long-lasting mark. For adults, for instance, this could be being in a violent altercation, being in a car crash, being at the scene of a natural disaster. For young children, it could be a wider range of things, because even not having the responsiveness you require and really desire from a caregiver, not being able to actually be soothed every time you cry, even things like this can feel intolerable. Now, tolerable stress doesn't go on to create long-lasting damage in the way that toxic stress does. Why? Because in the instance of tolerable stress, even if a very stressful, overwhelming thing happens, because of the context, you feel supported to get back to a place of safety. So I'll give an adult example. Let's say the person does have a car crash. They're pulled out of the car as soon as it's safe, and they're taken to the side of the road. It's made very clear to them, you're out of the road now, you survived, you're okay. They got their friends around them, they're talking to them, they're keeping them, they're trying to keep them in high spirits, they're trying to keep them conscious, and they're making sure they're catered for water and everything. They're taking the ambulance, their friend is there with them all the time, they feel connected, they feel like someone is there to support them, and people are regularly visiting them in the hospital. And then afterwards, they take gradual baby steps into getting back in the car, always feeling like they're in control of the process. Now, that's a scary situation to go through, but you never feel like you are fully vulnerable after you are taken out of the car. It feels like the danger is in the past, you've left it behind, and that is something which you can move on with without actually contracting some long-lasting ramifications. Toxic stress is where you go through something very stressful, but you aren't given the support, where you don't feel like you can get back to a place of safety, where you feel like you don't really have any control over the situation, you're powerless, and you're on your own. Babies and younger children in general, instants can be more likely to lean towards toxic stress the younger you get, because A, you have no ability to control what's happening in your life, or very, very little beyond being able to cry out for someone's support. B, you don't really have many past experiences to fall back on, past experiences where you exercise control and where you're able to show resilience and where you're able to draw on other support. And also because there's just a wider range of things that feel dangerous. The parental separation, the low maternal responsiveness, these feel like genuine threats to you in the way that they don't really to an adult. And so this is why, as much as it's worth bearing in mind how not all stress is bad, and you still need examples of positive stress, and you can still have instances where you go through something very stressful but end up more resilient, then the younger you get, the more attention is needed to these sorts of instances to make sure they don't go on to cause long-lasting damage. So I am going to read out the key points in this one because I think they are important. There's this phrase you sometimes get that it's all in your head. The phrase that never really made much sense given that your head contains the most important and impactful organ in your entire body. But ultimately, even on that basis, it's not true. Trauma is very physiological. We saw with the Romanian orphans that it can have a very strong impact on the physical development of the brain. We saw an example, the bear in the woods, that when you go through that, when you experience the stress response system, then you're having very physical symptoms in your body. And we saw that if you experience trauma, then the long-lasting impact can also maintain those physical symptoms. And the second one is that what causes trauma isn't necessarily the stress itself. It's whether or not you feel like you can get to a point of safety afterwards. And so it's really the context around it that can have a very big impact. Obviously, an incident can still be bad enough to still potentially cause negative impact. But in terms of whether it does and how bad it is, that's often influenced by the aftermath. And that's very important to take into account for young children. So we've got about 5 minutes left there. I'm going to quickly whiz through what I mean by resilience, just so you get the full package here. And if anyone does have any questions, feel free to ask them in here, either now or later. We'll run a little over 60 minutes, and then I will be monitoring the comments a bit later and be happy to answer any questions you have if you're watching this after the initial broadcast date. So we're going to end on something a little bit more positive. We've talked about how the brain develops in the early years for both good and bad. We've talked about attunement and how you first develop that sense of empathy with others and start to bond with others, how that moves into attachment and how that can form the basis for how we secure relationships in later life. We've talked about trauma, what it is, how it happens, how it does and doesn't happen in some instances. Now we're going to talk about the flip side of the coin, resilience. What actually builds our emotional resilience to be able to cope with adversity as best as possible, to help us heal from it, at least some part of the way, and just to give us the confidence and self-esteem that makes life better. A little bit of an insight here. When Public Health Wales look into what they call adverse childhood experiences, sometimes uses indicators of potential instances of trauma, they often find that the higher number of adversities you experience, the more likely you are to experience a range of negative outcomes, including in terms of mental health. Well, here's the flip side, really. When they ask people whether or not they'd experienced a range of different things in their childhood that could help boost their resilience, they realised that the higher the number of factors they were scoring on, the less likely they were as adults to experience mental illness or suicidal ideation. So this has a very positive impact. It's not just the traumas you experience, it's how they balance out with the resilience factors too. So what do I actually mean by resilience? Well, we're talking about this sense. Well, firstly, what I should say, there's no part of your brain that is the resilience part. It's a combination of various different psychological factors that give you this sense that you can cope with adversity and cope with life in general. Firstly is a sense of control. Control is very key. As humans and our brains, we desperately desire stability so that we can understand the world, and being able to control it is a key part of that. So that's control around the things in your life, and also having a sense of control over your emotions and behavior. You feel like you understand them. You feel like you are able to interpret them accurately, and ultimately you're able to control the way in which you act around others. Connectedness is another key thing. We've talked a lot today about feeling connected with other people and the impact that can have on your psychological well-being. Well, connectedness is a very key thing in order to feel emotionally resilient too. And that doesn't necessarily just need to be close compatriots, friends and families are key too, but also your neighbours, your colleagues, various other people you come across. Social interaction is generally very, very beneficial on the whole. So if we're going to look at the sort of things that help a child become emotionally resilient, do take a moment, if you like, just have a think through anything that you think should be on this screen, anything that happens within the home, within the community, or other experiences they have. And it is worth indicating them in these different categories, because ultimately, as much as you tend to focus on what happens in the home life, and as much as that tends to be very important, these are where your closest relationships often are, and especially during the early years, your highly important ones. The relationships you have with people in your community, with your friends, and the experiences you have to go out and actually learn skills and try new things and push the boundaries and feel that sense of control in your life are all very key too. And you can see that here in this summary. I've gone and picked out a few key examples I think are important when we're talking about what creates a resilient child. And it's worth bearing in mind that these aren't just for older children. This applies to infants as well, just to slightly modified for their level of maturity. So on the left-hand side, we're looking at what it means in order to be some of the more positive aspects of parenting. The idea that you're always going to be there and available for them, that you're always going to actually show love and acceptance to them, come what may. And this is obviously very key for an infant who knows they're vulnerable and can't look after themselves. So getting this impression that the caregivers are there to look after them can be incredibly soothing. And it can really open up the right-hand side of the screen here, where we start talking about some of the more traditional ideas behind resilience. Actually, someone being able to develop discipline through having rules and boundaries, through knowing what they can and can't do, and someone being able to actually push the boundaries. Sorry, that's a different wrong phrase to use. Someone being able to actually exercise independence, to go out and try new things, learn new things, get things wrong, learn from that and bounce back. This is what we tend to think about when we think about older children and adults. But for infants, literally walking around the house, crawling around the house, bumping into things, picking up things, playing with toys, meeting new people. These are all these experiences that involve actually pushing their boundaries and exercising independence. So all of this is very relevant to how they develop their sense of emotional well-being and the confidence and self-esteem that comes from it. Now, that's how you create a resilient child. I'm just going to quickly show you the key points from this section here. And I did want to end on a more positive angle, because when you talk about, we do a lot of training in trauma-informed practice and trauma-informed services, and you can end up getting bogged down talking about the negatives and how negative experiences can go on and cause these long-lasting adaptations that really aren't well suited to the person's life later on. So it is quite nice to actually talk about the flip side, to talk about how people can actually improve their emotional well-being, improve their confidence and self-esteem, and how it's actually the combination of their ability to generate resilience, as well as the negative factors that can help define how they react in circumstances. And the positive thing really from this is that you're never too old in life to build resilience. You're never too old to try new things and to actually push yourself out of your comfort zone. You're never too old to forge new relationships and to strengthen the ones you have. You're never really too old to seek guidance from other people too. And that last part, healing happens in relationships. This goes back to the presentation I gave, I talked about earlier, by Sir Harry Burns, where he said that ultimately social connections have the greatest impact on our life expectancy. Well, the same happens when we're looking at recovering from early life experiences. As much as trauma during the early years can have a very profound effect and can be quite difficult to resolve, ultimately within the context of close, loving relationships, a person can very often make very good progress. And that's it. That's the end of that. I'm going to just stop sharing now. Well, I hope you did find that interesting and useful. That was a quick whistle-stop tour through the areas of early years brain development and also how that relates to different stages in life as well. I hope you found that interesting. And if you do have any comments, if you're watching this a bit later, or if you are watching now, feel free to add them to the live stream. They're going to come up on the Facebook page, so I'm going to be able to answer them a bit later. But on top of that, if you are interested in this topic, Wave Trust is going to be running a series of early years masterclass seminars. The first one starting next week on the 15th of July, and the next two on the 18th of August and 21st September. If you go on the 7030 campaign Facebook page, you'll see in the pinned post the link to those events. These aren't going to be run by myself. They're going to be run by my CEO, George Hosking, who has 25 years experience in this field and is going to be able to bring a lot of that to this very fascinating and interesting topic. Thank you there, Susie. I really do appreciate that. And thank you then, Talia, as well for your question earlier. I'm going to clock off now, so I hope to be able to speak to more of you in the comments later. But otherwise, have a lovely evening there, and I'm sure I'll see you again soon.